Story 1. A table for sale, but you'll pay a price. One day, as I was browsing through Craigslist, I stumbled upon a listing for a really cute vintage table that would fit perfectly in my tiny, somewhat retro-looking apartment. The description said it was in great condition, and the price? It was a steal. Not wanting to waste any time, I quickly contacted the seller. "I've had some interest in it," the seller said, "but if you can get here in the next few hours, it's yours." "I'm going to go pick it up," I told my roommate. "Will you come with me so that I don't have to go alone?" My roommate looked at me with disappointment on her face. "I can't. I've got to leave for work in a few minutes," she said. "But it's really unsafe to be going to a stranger's house all alone. You shouldn't do it." I thought about the table and how cute it was. I really wanted it, and the seller told me that there were others interested in it. So, despite my roommate's warning, I messaged the seller. "Yes, I can be there shortly." Placing the address into the GPS, it looked to be in a safe neighborhood. It wasn't a neighborhood that I was overly familiar with, but I believed it to be a safe area nonetheless. I would soon discover just how wrong I was. I remember feeling my stomach sink as I approached the house. It was super sketchy, with its peeling paint, overgrown yard, and a general aura of neglect. My gut was sending warning signals, but then I thought about the table and how it would look in my living room. "I'm already here," I told myself. "Let's just get it done and get out of here." I exited the car, keeping my head on a swivel as I approached the front door. As I slowly pressed the doorbell, my sixth sense seemed to be screaming at me to turn around. When the door opened, I was hit with another wave of apprehension. The man inside was a mess. He had unkempt hair, stained clothing, and an unsettling grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. His voice was unnervingly friendly as he said, "Oh, you're here for the table, right? It's inside. Come on in." He said this as he looked around behind me, as if to check to see if I were alone. Every alarm bell in my head started ringing. The interior of the house was dimly lit, and what I could see was in disarray. Something was seriously off. I found myself stepping back, stuttering something about having forgotten my wallet at home. The urgency in his voice as he tried to convince me to come inside only heightened my fear. "It's fine, dear," he said. "Come on in. You've got nothing to worry about. You're going to need my help carrying this out to your SUV." There was something so sinister about the entire situation. The look in his eyes, and the way he smiled. It was like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Finally, the alarm bells were too loud. I turned on my heels and sprinted to my car. My heart was slamming against my ribcage. As I fumbled with my keys, his muffled calls followed me, but I didn't dare to glance back until I was safely inside my vehicle, doors locked. He stood at the doorway yelling, like it was a threshold he couldn't cross, like he didn't want to be seen in the open. I hit the ignition and drove away as fast as I could. When I was at a safe distance, I pulled over. My entire body was shaking from the adrenaline. I finally gathered myself and returned to my apartment. There, I took a cold shower, as if trying to cleanse myself of the entire experience. Later that night, my roommate returned, and I recounted the entire ordeal to her. She scolded me, as she had every right to do. "I told you," she said. "Something terrible could have happened to you." A few days later, I was mindlessly watching the news only to be jolted upright by a familiar image. There he was, the creepy guy being arrested for several crimes he'd committed using that abandoned house as a base. The report said he was a squatter and had been luring people there through online marketplaces with various scams and potentially dangerous intents. I felt sick and shaky, thinking of what could have happened if I'd ignored my instincts and stepped inside. I reported my interaction with him to the police, including the messages and the online account he used. That experience was a sobering lesson in trusting my intuition over a seemingly good deal. I didn't get the table, but I was lucky enough to escape a possibly dangerous situation. Now, safety trumps everything else, and no piece of furniture, no matter how perfect, will ever change that again.
Story 2. I saw the Fouke monster feeding. On the list of places that you've never been to, or will never go, Fouke, Arkansas is probably somewhere at the top. It's a tiny town in the southwesternmost part of the state. It's only really known for one thing, the Fouke monster, the subject of an early 1970s film called The Legend of Boggy Creek. The monster supposedly doesn't exist, but I'm here to tell you that it does. I know this because I've seen it with my own eyes. In the early fall of 2016, I was making my way up north from Shreveport, Louisiana to Texarkana. I worked for one of the world's largest delivery companies, so at times I found myself driving late night or early morning hours. On this particular occasion, I was driving a large delivery van just after 2 a.m. in the morning. I was on the interstate, about 5 miles south of Fouke, and there was nobody else in sight. As I rounded a corner, something caught in my headlights in the distance. Just off to the side of the road, a deer was laying there, presumably hit by a vehicle at some point and left for dead. Nothing unusual about that. People see dead deer on the side of the road all the time. But what was unusual is that there was something with it, something large. At first I thought it was a bear. I began to slow my vehicle to get a better look. As I inched closer, I could see that this was no bear. It was something very large. It was kneeling, and it was feeding. A sudden feeling of dread and fear washed over me as I crept closer. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. If it wasn't a bear, the only other thing that it could have been was a man in a ghillie suit. But it couldn't have been that either. It was just way too large. It had hair all over, unnaturally elongated arms and hands, and it was using those arms and hands to carve out the insides of this deer. It was just scooping and eating as quickly as it could. It was primal and terrifying. It had blood all over its hands, mouth, and chest. It was the most horrific and grotesque sight I had ever seen. There was one other thing, too. It was staring directly at me. I was confused, curious, mortified, and terrified all at once. As I inched closer, it never wavered. Its eyes were locked onto me, and it just kept feeding. It's as if it were telling me, if you stop, this will be the last thing you ever see. As I got within about 30 feet or so, I snapped to my senses and smashed the gas pedal. I sped down the road, my heart nearly pounding out of my chest. As I reached Fouke, I felt like I was far enough down the road to be clear of it, so I pulled into a gas station to gather myself. When I stepped into the store, I was still shaken. There was a man behind the register. "You doing all right?" he asked with a curious look. I was sure that he noticed that there was something going on with me. "Yeah, I'm okay," I said. "Just need to grab a cup of coffee to keep myself awake." This was an obvious lie. My senses were on full alert and I couldn't have been any more awake. "I hear ya," the man said. I grabbed a cup of coffee and took it to the register. Pulled between wanting answers and risking sounding crazy, I finally looked at the man and said, "Hey, this is going to sound weird, but I saw something on the side of the road." "Okay," the man said. I continued. "It was big, and I thought it was a bear, but as I got closer, it didn't look like a bear." The man looked at me and slightly nodded his head up and down as if to say, "Oh, you've seen it." "Do you know what it was?" I asked. The man took a breath and kind of stared off into the distance for a moment, like he was contemplating what to say to me. "Let me just say," he paused for another moment, "things around these parts that are supposed to be legends really aren't, and I'll leave it at that." I looked at him, half confused and half understanding. "If you see anything like that again, next time it's best to just keep driving and pretend that you didn't." I nodded, still in somewhat of a daze. I thanked the man, grabbed my coffee, and left. For about another year, I continued to drive that route, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. Most nights were uneventful, as they should have been. Every now and then, however, I would spot a deer on the side of the road, and my heart would start pounding. The events of that night left an obvious mark on me, and they continue to do so even to this day. The legend of Boggy Creek, it seems, isn't really a legend after all. Story 3. The Girl at the Door. I never thought an overnight shift at a fast food restaurant could turn into the most horrifying night of my life. My manager, Daryl, approached me one day with his usual nonchalant demeanor, asking me to work an overnight cleaning shift in preparation for a visit from some high-level executives the following morning. Despite the short notice and unusual hours, from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., I agreed, recognizing the urgency in his request. The night started typically. As soon as the lobby closed at 10 p.m., I began my work, scouring every inch of the restaurant to ensure it was pristine for the upcoming visit. The drive-thru crew worked busily, providing a subtle background noise that broke the eerie silence typical of late-night shifts. After their departure around 1 a.m., the restaurant fell into a silence that, for some reason, heightened my alertness. It wasn't until 1:30 a.m., when an unexpected timid knock at the lobby door jolted my attention. There, through the glass, stood a young girl, no older than 20, her eyes pooling with a mix of desperation and urgency. She gestured toward her phone, and then made a talking motion with her hand, signaling she needed to make a call. My instincts, typically inclined towards assistance, nudged me to help her. The battery on my phone died. "Can I use yours to make a call?" she asked through the glass door. It was strict policy that we were to never unlock the door or let anyone in after hours. This included family and friends, and it definitely included complete strangers. She looked so innocent, though, and my heartstrings pulled to help her out. Yet something felt unsettlingly off about the situation. My hand hovered over the door lock, hesitation now building. But just as I made the decision to go ahead and unlock it, I noticed a subtle movement in the dimly lit periphery of the parking lot. My heart pounded loudly in my ears as I leaned slightly, trying to get a better view of the shadow lurking just around the corner of the building. "Hey," she said. "Are you going to open the door?" Her pleas, though seemingly genuine, concealed an undercurrent of urgency that didn't quite align with her initial mild demeanor. I hesitated more. "Open the door now," she snapped at me. Her face had now completely changed. The distressed damsel she'd presented just moments before was now gone, and what stood on the other side of the window seemed annoyed and frustrated. I shook my head slightly, gesturing that I would use my phone to call someone for her. "I'll call the cops for you," I said. "They can come and help you." She now appeared to be fuming. Nevertheless, I went to retrieve my phone. When I returned, she was gone. Nowhere to be found. I looked all around the periphery of the restaurant. There was no one. The remaining half hour until my shift ended was nothing but fear, paranoia, and second-guessing. When my shift ended, I darted to my car as fast as I could. I never saw the girl again. Looking back now, the whole situation makes my hair stand on end. I was just a hesitation away from unlocking that door. Then what? Who was in the dark corner of the parking lot? What was their intent? Thankfully, I'll be able to ponder over those questions. Had I opened that door, though, it might be a different story. Story 4. Got a light? Back in 2007, I was making a long drive out from northern Utah into Steamboat Springs, Colorado for some business. It was a decent drive, and I got a late start. While en route, my old college buddy Rick gave me a call. We hadn't talked in a while, so it was the perfect time to catch up. We chatted up a bit, and during the call, he mentioned that I'd be driving pretty close to Skinwalker Ranch, a place notorious for paranormal happenings. I shrugged it off, chuckling at his attempt to rattle me up with ghost stories and legends. I didn't believe in such things, and I wasn't the type to get spooked easily. After a good laugh, I let him go and reached down for a cigarette. I had one left and a long drive still ahead, so I decided to restock and refuel. It was dark by the time I pulled into this small gas station. I refueled and walked inside to grab a snack and some cigarettes. Inside, I found myself alone with the clerk, a middle-aged guy with a friendly enough smile. "How's it going?" the guy said. "Good, you?" I said back. With a slight chuckle, the man replied, "Couldn't be better." I grabbed a bag of chips and a drink and walked over to the counter. "Let me grab a pack of Marlboro Lights," I said. "Sure thing," the clerk said as he turned around to grab them. As he was doing so, the conversation I had just had with Rick about Skinwalker Ranch was still on my mind. On a whim, I decided to ask the clerk about it. After all, I assumed he was a local and probably had some stories. "Hey, I'm not from around here. What's up with this Skinwalker Ranch?" I said to him. As the man turned around, his light-hearted demeanor changed instantly. He looked at me sternly, his eyes wide, and he slowly shook his head from side to side. It was an unspoken look that conveyed a clear message. We don't talk about that here. The mood in the atmosphere changed so quickly. Not knowing what else to do, I stuttered, well, all right, man, have a good night," as I grabbed my things. The clerk said nothing, but again, his expression conveyed another message loud and clear. "You've been warned." As I headed back to my car, a man emerged from out of nowhere. His appearance was sickly, his clothes ragged and dirty, clinging to a skinny frame. This guy was the definition of creepy. "Hey man, you got a cig?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, but then obliged, more out of a desire to avoid trouble than any real generosity, to be honest. "Got a light?" he asked. "Yeah, sure," I said back. I looked down as I reached into my pocket, trying not to fumble everything in my hands. Between separating the lighter from my keys and some loose change in my tight pockets, it became more of a task than it should have been. When I finally got a grip on the lighter and looked up, what I saw caught me completely off guard. I saw the end of this creepy man's cigarette already glowing, smoke curling up into the night air. How in the world had he managed that? I looked down for 5 seconds. I didn't hear a flick of a lighter or anything. And why did he ask me for a light if he already had one? Before I could say anything, though, he blurted out, "Where you headed?" Still in a state of confusion, I replied back, East. I got some business." But before I could even finish, he interrupted me. "Ah," he said, "heading east myself. Hey, you mind if I catch a ride with you?" Every alarm bell in my head was ringing. There was something completely off about this man, something that made my skin crawl. I stuttered through an excuse and his smile widened, but not in a friendly way. It was as if he knew something I didn't, and he was taking joy in that fact. I said. "Well, you see, And once more before I could finish, he interrupted me. "Ah, no worries, man. Totally get it. Well, you have a safe drive," he said, tipping me a wink that didn't feel comforting at all. With that, he turned around and just walked into the darkness in the distance. I jumped into my car and got the hell out of there, eager to put some distance between us. Thinking the creepiness was behind me, I lit a cigarette as I drove down the road. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The creepiness was just getting started. I was probably half a mile out when I noticed movement in the edge of my headlights, off to the right, on the shoulder of the road. It was hard to make out at first, but as I got closer it became unmistakable. It was the figure of a man running. Not just running. He was flying. I looked down at my speedometer. I was driving 45 miles per hour. This man had to be running 35. My brain didn't know where to go. Was I hallucinating? As I got closer, the figure turned his head back while continuing to run. My heart stopped. It was him, the creepy man from the gas station. His eyes were two glowing orbs, like they had eye shine from my headlights. I'll never forget it. As I approached closer, he smiled. It was a sinister, contorted smile. It looked like it stretched from ear to ear. I was absolutely terrified, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator. Despite my car's speed, he kept pace. I was in full-blown panic, my hands shaking. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I didn't believe that I was going to be able to get away from this man, or whatever it was. Then, out of nowhere, headlights appeared in the distance from an oncoming vehicle. As soon as the headlights got closer, the man abruptly stopped and faced my car. As I flew by, I remember us locking eyes. He still had that contorted smile on his face. For a second, everything was in slow motion. He looked at me and I looked at him, and the glow in his eyes conveyed another message. See you next time. But there would be no next time. I would never travel anywhere near Skinwalker Ranch again. Years have gone by now. I've told a few people this story. Most times I get blank looks, like they believe I'm making it up, like it didn't happen. But it did happen. And I'll tell you one thing. Whatever it is that's going on around that place, I don't want anything to do with it. Story 5. Come get it. One day, I ran across a Craigslist ad that seemed like a golden opportunity for someone like me, a DIY enthusiast always on the hunt for some free materials to use in my weekend projects. Free building materials. First come, first serve, it read. Simple, straightforward, and exactly what I needed for my upcoming deck repair. I messaged the seller, and they replied back quickly with 3 words, "Come get it," and the address. I quickly gathered some tools, hopped into my truck, and set the GPS for the destination. As I approached the address, I instantly started getting a bad feeling. The place was visibly run down. Buildings looked beat up, windows smashed in, and the whole area just gave off a creepy vibe. But there in front of me was the warehouse, looking just as worn as everything else. A tiny voice in my head said this might not be a good idea, but free stuff has a certain allure, you know? I pulled up and stepped inside. It was dimly lit, but the old building supplies were there, just as advertised. I remember the light barely squeezing through the dirty windows, but it was a decent enough haul if you weren't too picky. I yelled out, "Yo, anybody here?" Nothing. "Hello?" I yelled out a little louder. Again, nothing. I'm the type of person who usually goes ahead and does something and begs for forgiveness later, rather than waiting for a definite yes or no before I take action. So with that in mind, I went ahead and just started gathering up planks. While I was working away, I heard a weird noise after a bit, like a faint shuffling sound. Quite frankly, it gave me the chills, but I chalked it up to being in an old, creaky building and kept going, trying to ignore the uneasy voice in my head that something was definitely off. Then, clear as day, I heard a voice. My blood ran cold when footsteps started coming my way from the deeper, darker part of the warehouse. I turned around, and this guy, looking rough and unhinged, stepped into the little light there was. This damn man was holding a machete, I kid you not. I didn't know if this was some type of sick prank or if some guy was just out of his mind and had nothing better to do than try to lure a stranger in to have some fun with. Either way, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I dropped everything and bolted towards the door, and I swear I felt him right behind me. When I got to the truck, I locked myself in and saw him just standing in the doorway of the warehouse, watching me. Still, with a machete in his hand. I drove out of there like a bat out of hell, heart racing, and went straight to the police. Turned out, the guy was known to them, had a rap sheet, and was holed up in those buildings. He was a violent guy, they said, been known to do bad things to people. He hadn't murdered anybody yet that they had known about. Who knows, though? If I had stuck around, hell, I might have been the first. Learned my lesson that day. No amount of free stuff is worth ignoring that tiny voice in your head telling you to get the hell out of a situation. Trust your gut. It might just save your hide one day. Story 6. My terrifying experience with the ghost truck of Clinton Road. The summer of 2002, right after our high school graduation, my friends and I had a list of adventures we wanted to tackle. One particular dare was to drive down the infamous Clinton Road in New Jersey, rumored to be the most haunted road in America. There were 3 of us, and we set off a little after midnight. The first few miles were uneventful. The road was infamous for its sharp turns, and as my friend Jake navigated a particularly curvy stretch, we noticed it. A set of bright headlights in our rearview mirror, approaching fast. I remember Jake, who was driving, saying something along the lines of, "There it is," and then us laughing. But within seconds, a truck was tailgating us. Its headlights were so bright, they filled our car, making it hard for us to see. "That guy is in a hurry," I said, not even registering that it could actually be what we came to this road to see. I mean, we didn't actually think that we'd see something. Finally, my other friend Ryan joked, "Maybe it's that ghost truck." At this point, though, nervousness was starting to settle in. As Jake pressed on the accelerator, so did the truck. It stayed right on our tail. Silence now filled our car. The jovial mood from earlier was gone. Suddenly, the truck revved and swung to our left, attempting to overtake us. But instead of speeding past, it drove parallel to us. The truck, the windows, and everything else was pitch black, no silhouette of a driver, nothing. I was really getting nervous now. "Turn off somewhere," I said to Jake. But there was nowhere to go. The road was bordered by dense forests on both sides. Our best hope was to reach the end of Clinton Road. Then the truck did something unexpected. It sped up, going ahead of us quite a ways, and then stopped sideways, blocking our path. Jake skidded to a halt. At this point, we're all in a mess of a panic. The truck turned, and we were once again sitting in the blinding lights of its headlights. "We gotta get out of here," I said to Jake in a panic. Without warning, the truck's headlights went off. It was gone, disappeared. Jake made a U-turn. We couldn't see the truck anymore, but we didn't want to wait around. Jake drove like a man possessed. The curves and turns we had navigated earlier seemed even more dangerous now. "What was that?" "Where'd it go?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling now. We didn't have answers. We only knew we had to get as far away from Clinton Road as possible. Jake was driving with a sense of urgency now. "Hey man," I said, "be careful, this road has sharp..." And before I could complete my thought, we were blinded again. The headlights were back. This time they didn't drive up. They just appeared, like out of nowhere. They were right on our tail, and they were swerving back and forth, back and forth. At this point, we were absolutely terrified. We were yelling and screaming. Just as I thought that we were about to be overrun, the end of the road came into view, and the headlights vanished into thin air. We reached the end of the road, and Jake cut the car over onto the next road. After what felt like an eternity, we saw the familiar sight of the town's lights in the distance, and relief flooded us. Pulling over, Jake put the car in park, and we all sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. Ryan, usually so buoyant, looked pale, his usual humor gone. Finally, Jake spoke up. "That wasn't a normal truck, you guys. That road is haunted, and we just witnessed it." I nodded, my skepticism washed away. "You're right," I said, "but we're safe now, and that's what matters." Word about our night on Clinton Road spread fast. Some believed us, others laughed it off, but we knew what we experienced, and none of us have ever ventured near that road again. Story 7. My terrifying weekend at Hotel Savoy. There are moments in life when your curiosity gets the best of you, and you decide to face the unknown head-on. Last Halloween, I made that very decision. I booked a stay at the Hotel Savoy, renowned as America's oldest continuously operating hotel west of the Mississippi River, with a history dating back to 1888, and having hosted luminaries such as Harry S. Truman and John D. Rockefeller. I was intrigued. But what truly piqued my interest were the rumors of Room 505. The crisp air of late October nipped at my cheeks as I approached the hotel. Its towering facade, reminiscent of an era long gone, was covered in an array of autumnal hues. Checking in was a breeze, the staff was courteous, and the lobby resonated with the laughter of guests, presumably in town to celebrate Halloween. "Room 505, sir." The receptionist handed me the key, her face momentarily clouded with what I perceived to be a mix of concern and curiosity. Maybe she was wondering why someone would willingly stay in that room. The thrill of the weekend ahead made me ignore her fleeting expression. The antiquated elevator groaned and creaked, setting the tone for my stay. When I finally reached my room, the door opened with a faint but distinct screech, revealing an interior that seemed untouched by time. The furnishings were grand, echoing the late 19th century. But it was what lay in the ensuite bathroom that seized my attention. A bathtub, replete with classic taps and fittings. Exhausted, I decided to turn in early. The bed was comfortable, but my dreams that night? Far from it. I dreamt of a young woman dressed in period attire filling up the bathtub. She seemed sad, her expression haunting. I tried calling out to her, but the words never left my lips. In that hazy realm of sleep, I could feel her sorrow, thick and tangible. I woke with a jolt, my heart racing. What I attributed to remnants of the dream soon became my waking nightmare. The taps in the bathroom were on, and the tub was half full. Confused, and now genuinely concerned, I shut the water off, attributing it to some kind of plumbing issue. Trying to shake off the eeriness of the morning, I decided to spend the day exploring the city. But as the sun set, an inexplicable urge drew me back to the hotel. Perhaps it was morbid curiosity, or maybe something more profound. Dinner at the hotel's vintage restaurant was pleasant. Patrons exchanged tales of Halloween pranks and plans. But as dessert arrived, a soft melody wafted through the air. It sounded like someone was playing the piano, but the notes were melancholic, almost heart-wrenching. Asking the staff about it, they merely exchanged glances but said nothing. Retiring to my room, the weight of the history of the place seemed even more profound. I could almost feel the countless stories embedded in its walls, yet I was determined to have a peaceful night. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake once again by the sound of running water. Dreading what I might find, I ventured into the bathroom. The taps were on full blast, and the tub was overflowing. I quickly turned them off, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was no logical explanation. I was alone in the room, and the door was locked from the inside. But what truly sent me into a panic was the wet trail of footprints leading from the tub to the bed. In the dim light of the room, I could clearly see the silhouette of a woman, her dress dripping with water, sitting at the foot of the bed. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and I could hear that melancholic melody again, only this time it was clearer, as if played right next to me. I wanted to run, to scream, but fear rooted me to the spot. After what seemed like an eternity, the figure slowly faded away, leaving me in a room filled with an overwhelming sadness. I spent the rest of the night in the hotel lobby, too scared to return to room 505. At dawn, I approached the reception, eager to check out. I recounted my experience, and the receptionist, an older gentleman this time, nodded slowly. "You encountered Betsy Ward," he began. She was a young woman who stayed in room 505 in the late 1800s. It is said she died in that very bathtub, heartbroken. Many have reported the taps turning on and off, and some even claim to have seen her. I left the Hotel Savoy with a tale that would haunt me forever. My weekend getaway turned into a confrontation with the supernatural. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, some places carry with them memories so profound that they refuse to be forgotten. Visiting the Hotel Savoy was meant to be a daring adventure, a brush with the unknown. But what I didn't anticipate was how deeply the past can reach out, reminding us of the stories that once unfolded within historical walls. Room 505 is a testament to that. Would I ever return? Maybe, but not alone, and definitely not on Halloween. Story 8. The Uninvited Guest. I had been driving for hours, eager to get away from the city noise and spend a weekend alone in a remote cabin. The stresses of my day-to-day job had been taking a toll on me, and I needed a break. I had found a cabin on Airbnb that seemed perfect, secluded, surrounded by woods, and with an amazing view of a serene lake. The reviews were all positive, with guests praising the quiet beauty of the place. When I arrived, the sun was setting. The cabin was amazing, made of dark timber with large windows that allowed a beautiful view of the surroundings. After unloading my stuff and making a quick dinner, I settled in the living area with a book. The darkness outside enveloped the cabin quickly, but as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, attributing it to the unfamiliarity of the woods and the innate fear of the unknown that many of us have. After all, I was alone in a remote area. When I decided to turn in for the night, I made sure all the windows and doors were locked. My room had a large window facing the dense woods. Lying in bed, the eeriness of the silence felt profound. The earlier peace I felt was replaced by an unsettling quiet. Somewhere around 1 a.m., a creak in the floorboard of the front porch jolted me awake. At first I thought it was just an animal or something, but as I listened closely, it sounded more like footsteps. Trying not to panic, I sat up, straining my ears to pinpoint the source. The sound grew louder, and I could now clearly hear footsteps approaching the front door. Every so often they would stop, and a heavy silence would take over, only to be interrupted again by the steps. I dared not move, afraid to make any noise. The only source of light was the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. Suddenly, a shadow peeked around the corner of the window in the door. I was paralyzed by fear. The silhouette seemed to be of a tall man, but the features were indistinguishable. He pressed his face against the window, and I could see his breath fogging it up. His eyes were wide open, devoid of any emotion, staring directly at me. Our eyes locked, and though he made no move to enter or break down the door, The mere intensity of his gaze made my blood run cold. It felt like an eternity, but eventually he pulled away from the window and the sound of his footsteps slowly faded into the distance. I stayed frozen in my bed, too terrified to move. When dawn finally broke, the terror of the night gave way to the beautiful serenity of the morning. Gathering my courage, I decided to inspect the perimeter of the cabin. My heart sank when I saw the multiple sets of footprints, confirming what I already knew. Rushing inside, I immediately called the local police. They arrived within the hour, and I relayed the entire ordeal to them. They conducted a thorough search of the surrounding woods but didn't find anybody. However, they did find a campsite on the other side of the hill, not far from the cabin, which seemed to have been recent, but abandoned now. Not feeling completely safe anymore, I cut my trip short. I informed my Airbnb host of the incident, and they promised to look into the matter. I often wonder what would have happened if that creepy man had decided to do more than just watch that night. I've honestly never been so scared before in my life. It's a very unsettling feeling of knowing that you're being watched, and not knowing the intent of the person watching you. It's been a while since I've rented another Airbnb. I haven't sworn them off altogether, but I do believe my next rental won't be so isolated and remote. Story 9. I'm no longer alone in the facility. Working at the storage facility was always peaceful, but mundane, a regular 9 to 5 with occasional customer interactions, paperwork, and keeping an eye on the camera. But everything changed after we were struck by a streak of break-ins. My boss asked if I would be okay holding down the fort during the lonely, dark graveyard shift, a precaution to deter the thieves, I suppose. She and another worker would take the day shifts, and I would take the nights. Just for a week, she said. Pay and a half was a good incentivization, so I took it. The shifts went by without a hitch. I mostly watched the monitors, chugged coffee, and played on my phone. Before my last shift on the last night, I was sent to Home Depot with the company card and asked to fetch new bolt cutters since ours were done. They were old, rusted, and dull. It was then that I met a creepy man. He was there in the aisle, doing the same, looking for bolt cutters. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him looking at me. He was just staring at me, and it was uncomfortably creepy. Finally, he asked about the storage facility that I worked at. As I looked over, he was pointing at the company shirt that I was wearing. "Yeah," I said. "Just picking up some bolt cutters. The ones we have are old." He nodded his head and continued with questions. "What time do I usually work? How many people work there? What hours are we typically open?" They were weird questions, and uncomfortable to say the least. Not wanting to answer any more questions, I finally picked out a pair of cutters. "Well, have a good one," I said. "You too," the creepy man said. As I turned to walk down the aisle, I felt like his eyes were on me the entire time. I paid and left, brushing off the exchange as just a weird encounter with a creepy man. Returning to the storage facility, I settled in for a long night. As the night progressed a few hours, a thunderstorm rolled in. The winds were picking up, and the rain was coming in heavily. As I was sitting behind the desk, looking out at the rain, I noticed movement on one of the cameras. There was a tall, skinny person that had just hopped the fence onto the grounds of the facility. The person looked to be a man. He was hooded and dressed in dark clothing. It looked like he was carrying something too. I inched closer to the monitor, trying to get a better look. As I strained to look, it dawned on me what he was carrying. Bolt cutters. The man looked around, and then started making his way to one of the units. I started to reach for my phone, but couldn't take my eyes off of the monitor. He was swinging the bolt cutters around to his other hand, when out of nowhere, he looked up and directly into the camera. My heart, by now pounding uncontrollably, dropped into my stomach. He was wearing a mask. It covered his nose and his mouth, obscuring his identity. But his eyes were visible, and it was as if they were staring directly into mine through the monitor. By this time, I should have already been on the phone with the police, but I was absolutely frozen. Then, his head slowly looked down as if he was looking at something in the distance. As I watched, my heart dropped even further when I realized that he was looking in the direction of the office. the very office that I was sitting in, watching all of this unfold. Slowly he dropped the bolt cutters to the ground, never taking his eyes off of the office. I was shaking, and it was almost like I was in a trance. There was a voice in my head yelling, "Call 911! Call 911!" But I couldn't hear it because I was locked onto the monitor. The man slowly set the cutters down, and then began to walk slowly over towards my office. As he did so, he placed one of his hands inside a pocket. Just as he walked out of frame, he began pulling his hand back out. I was able to pick him up on another camera though, but this time I was viewing his backside as he was slowly approaching the office, which was in frame too. As he pulled his hand out, I could barely make out something that almost made me pass out. It looked like he was pulling out a knife. Just then, there was a huge crack of thunder, and then, as if things couldn't get any worse for me, the electricity went out. It was pitch black now, and there was a guy walking towards the office I was in with what I believed to be a knife. If any good came out of the electricity going out though, when the monitor shut off, it was as if I was jolted out of my trance. I threw myself under the desk and finally called 911. "There's someone here and I think they have a knife," I said to the operator in a panic. "I need the police here now." As I was speaking with the operator, the unthinkable happened. I began to hear jiggling from the door handle at the back of the office, the one located on the facility side of the entrance gate. I began shaking uncontrollably. "I need someone here now," I said in a panic. The operator tried to comfort me. "We've got officers on the way." Because I was under the desk, I couldn't see anything except the wall behind it, and the floor beneath me. But I could hear everything, and the man's determination to get into the office was escalating. Then, out of nowhere, the jiggling stopped. Any relief that I would have had was short-lived, though. After a brief pause, there was a huge bang. I wish it was thunder, but unfortunately it wasn't. The man was now trying to kick in the door. My eyes watered up with tears. "Please," I begged the operator. Another bang, this time more violent. At that moment, I felt like the next kick would burst open the door. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the final blow, the one that was going to leave nothing between the intruder and me. The tears were now pouring from my eyes, and I could barely control my breathing. I waited, for what felt like an eternity, for the final blow to come, and for the door to burst open. 5 seconds went by, then 10, then 15, but the final blow never came. After what felt like at least a minute, I slowly opened my eyes. They revealed red and blue lights flickering off the wall behind the desk. The cops had arrived. I crawled out from under the desk. There were 2 cop cars. The one in front was pointing its spotlight towards me in the office. I rushed out of the office towards them. 2 more cars arrived. I detailed what happened. Because the electricity was still out, I couldn't raise the gate. So all of the cops took off on foot except for one who stayed back with me. After a thorough search, they found nothing. No intruder, no bolt cutters, nothing. The man had made his way out, leaving nothing but a few dents in the back door of the office. An investigation took place, but in my opinion, it seemed to be low priority. Nothing was ever stolen, the intruder never made entry into the office, and nobody was hurt. I even told them about the creepy man at Home Depot. I'm not sure they ever followed up on him. They did some extra patrols for a few nights, but after about a week or so, those stopped, and it was like nothing ever happened. Questions still haunt me. Who was this person, and why were they trying to get into the office? Why didn't they just try to steal something from a unit and then leave? Who was the creepy man at Home Depot, and did he have anything to do with this? Amongst these questions, there is one thing I do know for certain. I will never work another graveyard shift ever again. Story 10. A Night at Crybaby Bridge. You know, every town has its legends. Those tales that parents use to scare their kids into behaving, or stories teenagers dare each other to explore. In my small town, just 3 miles northwest of Monmouth, Illinois, we had the Crybaby Bridge. For as long as I can remember, older kids would tell us the gruesome tale of the school bus tragedy at the bridge. It was said that many years ago, during a particularly harsh rainstorm, an elementary school bus, filled with innocent children, met its doom there. A sudden flash flood washed the bridge out, and the bus, unable to stop in time, plunged off the side. every single child on board was claimed by the raging waters. But that's not the end of the story. Legend says that the spirits of those kids never left. It was rumored that if you positioned your car at the start of the bridge precisely at midnight and placed it into neutral, those same children would muster their ethereal strength to push your vehicle across. And if you were brave, or perhaps foolish, enough to sprinkle baby powder on your bumper, you'd see their tiny handprints as proof of their presence. My friends and I, we never really bought into the legend. Maybe because we thought we were too rational, too logical. But on Halloween night in 2006, a part of us wanted to see if there was any truth to it. We decided to take Mark's Jeep, big enough to fit all four of us, and old enough that we wouldn't be devastated if it got a scratch or two. As we approached the bridge, we shared light-hearted banter, laughing off our mild anxieties. The clock ticked closer to midnight. Following the ritual as we had heard it, I sprinkled baby powder all over the Jeep's bumper. We all inspected it, making sure every inch was covered, half expecting to see some marks already. But there was nothing, just the smooth white powder. Mark, in a dramatic fashion, aligned the Jeep at the start of the bridge. He placed the car into neutral and revved the engine, heightening our heart rates. Then we sat and waited. For something. Anything. Minutes felt like hours. Nothing happened. We all started laughing, chastising ourselves for even thinking this could be real. I remember my friend Sarah joking about how she'd have a better chance finding a ghost in her attic. We were on the brink of giving up, labeling this as another failed adventure when it began. It started as a faint, distant sobbing. "Is that a baby?" Mark whispered, but the sound grew, evolving into multiple cries, a mixture of countless voices, each one louder and more distressed than the last. Our chuckles died down instantly. Suddenly the Jeep lurched forward. It was subtle at first, like when you think you've forgotten to put your car in park. But then it quickly gained momentum. The wheels rolled over the old tarmac, and the once distant cries now sounded like they were right inside our car. My heart raced, every cry penetrating my ears, every sob tearing at my soul. In our panic, none of us thought to stop the car. It felt like we were in the clutches of an unseen force, hurtling us with increasing speed towards the other side of the bridge. Our laughter had been replaced with screams, our skepticism with pure, unadulterated terror. The Jeep accelerated quickly, faster and faster, until with one final jolt, it came to a halt, having crashed into the protective barrier on the other side of the bridge. We sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Our breaths were ragged, our hands shaking. As the reality of our situation sank in, we slowly stepped out, inspecting the Jeep for damage. That's when we saw them. On the baby-powdered bumper were dozens of tiny handprints, clear against the white backdrop. Handprints of children who had met their untimely end on that very bridge. The undeniable proof was right there in front of our eyes. We hopped back into the Jeep and drove back into town. It was quiet the entire way back. Honestly, I think we were all just too shaken to say much. Even now, years after the event, we reflect back and try to come to terms with it. The four of us don't talk about that night much. The weight of it hangs on us. I'm sharing this now, not as a dare or challenge, but as a warning. Some legends, no matter how unbelievable they seem, hold a grain of truth. Crybaby Bridge is real. Those children, they're still there, waiting. If you ever find yourself in Monmouth and hear the tale of Crybaby Bridge, remember our story. Respect the legend, and whatever you do, don't venture there at midnight.
Story 11. Mia and the Witch Lady, Ties That Transcend Time. The fall breeze was crisp, and a medley of orange and red leaves had begun to blanket my backyard. Every October, I'd get into the spirit of Halloween by decorating my house with spooky ornaments and setting up a haunted maze for the neighborhood kids. But this particular Halloween was different, for it was the first time we'd spend it in our newly bought ancestral home. The move into the old family home had been a decision born out of nostalgia. It was where my mother had grown up, and she had always regaled us with tales of her childhood spent running up and down the creaky stairs, chasing after her siblings. But while my two older children, Ben and Sophie, adjusted well to the new setting, my youngest, Mia, had an aversion to the upstairs section of the house. During our first week, Mia refused to go upstairs alone. If she had to use the bathroom, she'd resist for hours or pester her siblings until one of them accompanied her. I initially dismissed it as the usual hesitations children often feel in unfamiliar surroundings. But as days turned into weeks, her apprehension became a concerning pattern. One sunny afternoon, I sat Mia down in the living room, the golden rays of the setting sun streaming through the vintage curtains. "Sweetie," I began gently, "can you tell me why you're so scared of going upstairs?" She hesitated, her blue eyes darting away. "The old witch lady," she finally whispered, her voice quivering. My eyebrows knitted in confusion. "What old witch lady?" "The one near our bedroom closet," she elaborated, her voice barely above a whisper. "She has wild hair all over the place, and her hands, they look like claws." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to keep my composure. "Honey, there's no one in the house but us." "But Mommy," Mia's eyes filled with tears, "she's there, all hunched over and tiny, and she stares at me." This was troubling. Our home was old, but there were no signs of any squatters or stray animals. Moreover, Mia's description didn't match anyone we knew. To ease her fears, I decided to indulge Mia's imagination. Maybe if I could show her there was nothing in the closet, she'd get over her fear. That evening, armed with a flashlight, I took her hand and we walked upstairs. Together, we checked every nook and cranny of her room, especially the closet. As expected, there was no witch lady. A few days passed, and the incident with the witch lady was starting to fade. My family was invited to my parents' house for dinner. Over homemade pies and roasted turkey, we caught up, laughing at shared memories. The topic of our ancestral home came up, and I mentioned Mia's odd fear of the upstairs and her description of the witch lady. I tried to keep the tone light, but there was an unmistakable shift in the room's energy. My mother, usually the life of the party, went unusually quiet. She rose from her seat and walked over to an old wooden cabinet that housed family albums. She pulled out an aged black and white photograph and handed it to me. The photo depicted a frail, elderly woman. Her hair was unkempt, almost wild-looking, but it was her hands that caught my attention. They were twisted and deformed, with large knots at the knuckles, making them resemble claws. Her posture was hunched, and she sat in an old wheelchair. "Mia," I beckoned, my voice shaky. "Is this the lady you saw?" My daughter's face drained of color as she nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "That's my grandmother," my mom spoke up, her voice heavy with emotion. "Your great-grandmother." I looked at my mother, my mind racing to make sense of it all. "But Mom, Mia never met her." My mother took a deep breath. She had severe rheumatoid arthritis. The condition deformed her hands and made her hunch over. Because of her condition, she was confined to that wheelchair for the latter part of her life. I remembered faint tales of my great-grandmother, how she was bedridden during her last days and had passed away in the very house we now lived in. But I had never seen her pictures, let alone shown them to Mia. "The crazy hair," my mom continued, tears forming in her eyes, "was because she had to rely on someone else to comb it. Sometimes it remained unkempt." The room was enveloped in a somber mood. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and the realization was both astounding and terrifying. Somehow, Mia had seen my great-grandmother, someone she had no knowledge of. That night, as we returned home, the earlier festive spirit of Halloween was overshadowed by the chilling revelations of the evening. While I still couldn't fathom how Mia had witnessed an apparition of our ancestor, I felt an odd connection to our family's past. It was as if, through Mia, my great-grandmother was reaching out, reminding us of the ties that bind us through time and generations. While Halloween approached with its ghosts and ghouls, we had encountered a specter far more intimate and inexplicable. The festive decorations now seemed trivial compared to the eerie connection my daughter had experienced. Mia never mentioned the witch lady again. Perhaps the acknowledgement of her presence and understanding her identity was all that was needed. The ancestral home, with its creaky stairs and old memories, held more mysteries than we had ever imagined. And as Halloween night descended upon us, we couldn't shake off the eerie feeling of being closely watched by the ghosts of our own past.
Story 12. Apartment 407. Moving to the heart of the city had always been a dream for Clara and me. After months of searching, we finally settled on a nice apartment complex in the downtown area. The apartment had nice amenities like a rooftop garden, a state-of-the-art gym, and a spacious pool area. Our apartment, on the 4th floor, was a sprawling 2-bedroom space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a nice view of the pool below. The floor, we were told, only had a handful of tenants. That didn't bother us much. One of those tenants, however, seemed to be a mystery to us. Apartment 407, right next to us, appeared to house someone. We'd often hear footsteps in the corridor, and the sound of the door opening and closing. But by the time we'd peek through our peephole, there would be no one there. One evening, while Clara was trying out a new recipe in our kitchen, an eerie moaning echoed from 407. It sounded like a blend of pain and sorrow, a sound that really gave us the chills. Concerned for our unseen neighbor, I decided to check on him. Stepping out, I knocked on the door. As soon as my knuckles made contact, the moaning stopped. I waited, feeling the weight of the silence, but no answer came. "Hello?" I said. "Is everything okay?" There was no response. Days passed, and the events of that evening weighed on my mind. Clara and I would at times press our ears up against the wall and would hear footsteps and mumbling coming from the next apartment over. Trying to shake everything off, we focused on settling into our new life. We frequented the gym, dined at the nearby gourmet restaurants, and spent lazy afternoons by the complex's nice pool. One evening, as we lounged by that pool, Clara suddenly tapped me on my leg. "Look," she whispered, discreetly motioning with her head upwards. Following her gaze, I saw a shadowy figure standing behind the sheer curtain of apartment 407. But in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. The sight was so fleeting that I would have dismissed it as a trick of the light had Clara not seen it too. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to speak with the apartment manager, Mrs. Patterson. She was a sweet woman in her 50s, with silver streaks in her hair and a perpetual warm smile. Upon inquiring about the tenant of 407, her expression turned from one of casual interest to confusion. "No one's been living in 407 for several weeks," she said, her voice laced with genuine surprise. I relayed our strange experiences to her, the sounds, the silhouette, the eerie moaning. Mrs. Patterson, now visibly concerned, decided to accompany me to the apartment. As we approached the wooden door of 407, those all too familiar murmurs met our ears. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then knocked. Instantly the sound ceased. She knocked again. Nothing. No sounds and no answer. With a heightened look of confusion on her face, she unlocked the door. The apartment was a stark contrast to ours. While our unit was filled with life, love, and warmth, 407 was cold and desolate. There was nothing there. No furniture, no belongings, and no person. Just a single sheer curtain covering the living room window. There was no sign of recent occupancy at all. Mrs. Patterson, her face pale, relayed the tragic history of the apartment. Mr. Applegate, a solitary elderly man, had been its tenant for years. Known for his reclusive habits, he rarely ventured out. Tragically, he had suffered a fatal fall in the apartment. It appeared that he had tripped, his head taking a blow on the counter before coming to rest on the floor. His agonized moans eventually alerted a neighbor down the hall, but help arrived too late, and Mr. Applegate passed away right there, before the ambulance could arrive. These events, she said, happened about 3 weeks before we moved in. The weight of what Mrs. Patterson was telling me was immense. How could this be? The sounds, the footsteps, the moans. Someone had to be in that apartment, but there was no one. As I later relayed the revelation to Clara, I could see the blood run out of her face. "That's impossible," she said. "We're always hearing noises from that apartment." "I know," I said back to her, "but the manager told me that there's been no one in that apartment for weeks, not since Mr. Applegate died." Deciding that this was a little bit too much for us to handle, we requested to be moved to a different room and floor. Mrs. Patterson, out of the kindness of her heart, accepted and moved us to the 6th floor. Life has resumed its rhythm in our new space. No noises, no footsteps, no murmurs or moans. Sometimes, though, while enjoying the sunset by the pool, Clara and I find our eyes drifting up to that window. Every so often, I swear, you can still catch a glimpse of someone walking around. In apartment 407,